Do the Dallas Cowboys have to select an offensive tackle or offensive lineman in round one? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your
Locked
daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked on Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 if your bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. On today's show, we are getting to your Twitter questions. And Landon, there's quite a few of them. It seems like some people are upset with this Cowboys team right now. So we're not surprised that Cowboy fans are a little eager to vent about this team, right?
No, I mean, and look, I mean, the off season is always the time when there's the most fervor, right? Like, because there's just like constant hand wringing over moves and lack of moves that the Cowboys are doing. And it feels like, you know, it's a combination of the way the last season ended versus how this off season is going so far. It feels like, yeah, Cowboys fans are definitely up in their fury and they've got questions. And man, we're going to give you the best answers that we've got because I don't know if the Cowboys have answers to some of these questions.
Yeah, all right. So we've got some ones I'm actually going to combine together so we can answer as many of these as possible. But first one from Greg, he wants to know, do the Cowboys have to select an offensive lineman in round one, considering their need at left tackle and center and because of the position, because of how good, you know, the offensive line talent is in round one?
Yeah, I don't think they have to. You know, I mean, what's have to, right? Like, I think ultimately, like,
I mean, like, okay, so our friends at FanDuel have some odds on the first position the Cowboys will draft in round one. And the last time I checked, it was like minus 200 to draft an offensive lineman. Okay. Feels about right.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think that sort of like certainty that the Cowboys are going to draft an offensive lineman, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I don't think, you know, I think a lot of people are kind of viewing this as like, you know, the Cowboys drafting exclusively for need, when in reality, it's kind of like they're generating a need at a position where there's going to be a lot of depth at their pick. Right. So, but to answer the original question, no, they don't necessarily have to draft an offensive lineman in round one. I think it makes the rest of the draft a little bit more difficult. You know, I think because you're still trying to find a spot where you can maximize the value at that certain position of where you're picking and the potential position that you're looking to fill. And I think specifically at tackle, that's going to be tough to fill outside of the first 2 or 3 rounds, right? I think, you know, center, you could probably, if you wanted to wait till round 3, you could there's still some guys available that you could get. But I think tackle is a spot that, especially considering that you're talking about your starting left tackle right now, that unless you're going to get a guard and the plan is to use Tyler Smith as your left tackle, you're running a gambit by skipping the first round tackle market. And if you skip the second round, then you're really in trouble. So unless the Cowboys are planning on going to get an offensive tackle, that definitely will change the angles. I would say it's likely to be an offensive lineman, but to answer the questioner's question, it doesn't have to be. It just kind of makes things a little bit more, you know, tight. You got to kind of run that. I mean, think about what we went through with what was a couple of years ago with the tight end situation. Where there was this huge run and we thought we could wait, and we were hoping that we could wait to the third round. And we missed the run. We were trying to remember, we were thinking tight end or running back, and we weren't sure if they were going to be able to get both, and we missed the run. So there is that kind of tightrope walk that you have to do. And it's a lot of luck that you need to have fall right. But I think to answer the question, no, they don't necessarily have to wait. It's just, you know, it makes everything a little bit more tight. You have to rely a lot more on luck.
So, Landon, the only problem with the Cowboys waiting in round one or not waiting till after round one to
Yeah.
grab an offensive lineman is, can you actually expect any of those guys to come in and start right away? I
No.
mean, we've seen the Cowboys draft 2 guards on day 2, Connor Williams and Connor McGovern. McGovern didn't start until, was it year 3 that he started? And Connor Williams did start in year 1, but was a pretty, what do you want to say, pretty below average guard as a
Yeah.
rookie.
Mhm.
That's my concern. Like, if you're waiting beyond round 1, the odds of you getting a starter are pretty low. The odds of you getting like a good starter are even lower. I do wonder like what this offensive line would look like if you ignored offensive line in round 1. I think that'd be pretty scary.
I think that if we were talking about any other year, I would absolutely not prescribe this. I mean, I'm not necessarily, I'm not prescribing it now, but I'm saying like I would say that this is a gambit not worth running for almost any other year. However, this year there are a ton of tackles, like a ton, meaning more than what will go in the first round, right? Like there will be spillover into the second round for at least the Patrick Paul, Tyler Guyton, level
Kingsley
of
Sumata. Yep.
guys you feel like aren't maybe finished products, but could get there, in time for the
But do they
season.
fall to 56th though?
I don't know. I mean, I think maybe it's possible. Look, and that's why this is not advisable. I mean, it's a tightrope walk, but at the same time, if Brock Bowers falls to you at 24, or if I'm trying to think of who would kind of push you off your spot, Brian Thomas, or
Quinyon
like,
Mitchell or
one of these guys that like you just did not expect to fall to you, that is a blue chip player, a legit first round player, falling to you at 24. If you really want to talk about BPA, like you kind of have to take those blue chip guys if they're a blinking light, even if it's not necessarily a need there, right? So I do think it's something you have to consider, and I think this is the year to try to consider it versus a regular average NFL draft year.
So I wanted to answer the rest of Mike Crum's question.
Yeah.
He wanted to know, like, assuming you do draft an offensive lineman in round 1, what's the best way to attack round 2? Is it to draft a running back? Is it to go after one of the linebackers? Hopefully like Edgerrin Cooper or Junior Colson falls. Like, we talk about sequencing all the time, and I know we're still like a month out, but for you, what's the best way to, or what's the best position to pair with an offensive lineman?
Maybe another offensive lineman.
Maybe.
I mean, I do think that there's a good opportunity to double dip here and get 2 very good quality starting offensive linemen, and plus players at each one of their positions. If not, I think you can kind of you look at the depth of the class overall versus what your needs are, and you see where there kind of is a lineup there. I think linebacker and running back is tough, right? Because it's like you could easily take those guys there and get the best one of you could go get Jonathan Brooks if that's who you like, or Colson, or whatever linebacker you want to go get, right? Like you could go get that guy and probably get the top guy at your second round pick, right? Or at least the second guy, if maybe one of these linebackers,
of the top 2 guys.
It's like, let's say Cooper goes somewhere in the middle of the second round, right? You could probably get the second best linebacker in the class. The problem is that you are also potentially missing out on a much better talent at other positions, right? Because I think, even the 5th best center, maybe a better overall football player than the second best linebacker, right?
I mean, like, you might get the 12th best receiver in round 2, but that might be a better player than the number 1 running back or the number 1 linebacker. And that's where it's going to be tricky.
Tough. Yeah. And I think especially if you don't take an offensive lineman in the first round, I mean, you almost feel like you've got to take an offensive lineman in the second round.
And that's why it's why I want Dallas to draft an offensive lineman in round 1, because if you get to round 2 and you're having to force a pick and there's just not a guy there, I think you could make a huge reach on an offensive lineman in round 2 and just still not get a starter, where if you're drafting one of those guys in round 1, not only is it going to probably be a starter for you, but I bet it ends up being a value just based on where these guys are being ranked and drafted right now.
And look, no one wants to hear this. And I don't like thinking about this, but this is how NFL teams think, and this is how we should think as well. The Cowboys created the need to tackle.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, they knew when they were doing their math on how much they wanted to pay Tyron Smith, they knew that they had a very rare opportunity to actually fill Tyron Smith's long-term, spot, to get out from underneath the specter of how are we ever going to replace Tyron Smith someday this season, because they have this opportunity in this draft class.
Yep.
So we cannot ignore the fact that the draft class and the depth at the tackle position in this draft class contributed directly to the Cowboys kind of capping how much they were willing to invest in Tyron Smith's future, because they knew at some point they had to build for the future at the position. And this is as good a year to try to do that as any.
I want to talk a little bit more about whether the Cowboys can afford to draft best player available in round 1. We will do that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament, whether you're betting on a big upset or a number 1 seed. It's time to go dancing on America's number 1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win the entire tournament. So just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We want to let you know about Locked On Sports Today. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Do you have to turn down that volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news of the day, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Landon, let's get to some more questions. This one's from Matt. He wants to know, do you believe that Dallas can go BPA in round one with the way that free agency has played out so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a little bit what we talked about last segment, right? Like, is it possible to still draft freely despite the fact that the Cowboys are kind of, in a very specific hole? Look, I think what we talked about last segment kind of holds true here, where I think the Cowboys, they didn't put themselves in this, but in ways they did. They knew what they were doing, right? They knew that the holes that they were creating in free agency were lining up with the strength of the draft, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's something that the Cowboys are actually pretty good at. And so I think, the traditional conversation of like holding your team accountable by making sure that they're drafting best player available every single pick, it doesn't really kind of hold true, because they find out who the best player available they think, or, the best position is probably the best way to think of it, the best position available at each, spot in each round. And then they create the holes in order for them to fill those holes, right? So that they can, replace labor with cheaper labor, right? So to answer the question, yes, of course, BPA is still an option. I mean, like I said, it makes the kind of sequencing problem that you have a little more difficult if you don't take an offensive lineman in the first round. But they're still in a situation that if like I said, an elite blue chip player fell to them, they could easily take them there. And even going deeper into the draft, right? Like, I think we generally say BPA, and I think in reality, players kind of get slotted into like tiers, and the tiers and clusters are broken based on your particular need or a specific. They have a gold star because they're a favorite or something. That's how those tiers kind of get broken, and that's kind of the last thing that they do before they get into the draft is kind of do those cluster breakers, right? So I think the answer is that no matter what, they do leave themselves the option because of exactly the CeeDee Lamb situation, right? Where someone could fall to you, and you need to be able to pull the trigger on that position. Cowboys really needed a cornerback, and they were definitely planning on drafting a cornerback in the first round.
Or an edge rusher.
Or an edge rusher, right? And suddenly CeeDee Lamb is available. I remember, and I'm sure you remember, all of us had a lot of doubts about the Cowboys front office. And I mean, many people, it was a foregone conclusion that that if CeeDee Lamb fell to the Cowboys, we were all talking about it 2 picks before that it happened. We were like, hey, it's the CeeDee Lamb's going to fall. The Cowboys are going to take Trayvon Diggs, and we're all going to be sad, right?
Well, that's actually not the guy I was going to be sad about. It was Caleb on Jason, who
that was
1 year.
Yeah, I know we would have been sad about Diggs, but we would have been sad the fact that we passed on CeeDee Lamb, right?
Yeah.
And so that didn't happen. The Cowboys took CeeDee Lamb, and the rest is so. I guess my point being that the Cowboys have done this previous to this, and have had this scenario that we're nervous about happen to them, right? Where the player that they didn't expect fell to them, and they were already laser focused on a position. And what did they do? They did the right thing. They picked the more talented player, and obviously they've been very well rewarded from that. So I don't imagine that they would avoid doing that in the future.
I'm just trying to think like out loud. Well, who would be the player, or what would be the position that would be so much of a blinking light for them that they would have to take it over an offensive tackle? Like, because even like you mentioned, Brian Thomas, like,
yeah.
I think Brian Thomas is a very good prospect. To me, it's not a CeeDee Lamb situation where if he falls to 24, like I feel like he should be drafted in the teens to early 20s. Like you mentioned Brock Bowers, like that's one, right? But if Brock Bowers is falling to the 20s, like there's obviously something wrong there. I don't know if we could get to the 20s and have something like that happen. Like it would be pretty strange.
The problem is, and again, this kind of points to the Cowboys are doing the right thing here. The problem is the best examples of what I'm talking about are likely offensive linemen.
Exactly. Right? I was just about to say that. Maybe it's like Talise Fuaga from Oregon State falls to you, and it's okay. We don't need a right tackle, but he's just the best offensive lineman there.
And there's just a ton of offensive line, players that are deserving of going in the first half of the first round. Maybe there just aren't that many teams that are interested in taking an offensive lineman with their top half of I mean, that's a lot of these guys are going to go off the board because there are a lot of players that teams that need those kind of players, but that doesn't mean that all of them are going to get taken. So what if Olu Fashanu falls to you, or what if one of these really top end tackles?
Well, and that's the thing is like Fashanu is one of the ones that I could see because listen, I've been doing these consensus board where I take all the top draft experts and I put their big boards into a spreadsheet. And I've noticed over the last couple of weeks, Fashanu has gone for somebody who is like being ranked inside the top 8 to like being ranked now down to like the mid-teens. Would it be that crazy to see him fall from like 17th overall down to 24? No. So maybe it is. I think you're right. It probably is an offensive lineman. It's the most likely to be the guy that falls. That makes it just a no-brainer pick for the Cowboys.
I think just to kind of sum up these first 2 segments, really, the thing that we need to realize is that we're worried about the Cowboys taking the best, missing out on the best player available because they have this strong needed offensive lineman. And I'm here to tell you that there is an extremely high likelihood that no matter what happens on Friday or Thursday that week, right, that the Cowboys could be at 24 and best player available, top 3 best player availables are all offensive linemen.
Yeah.
So like again. I'm sad Tyron Smith's gone. I didn't want to see him play for any other team. I don't want to see him in another jersey. But when you look at the way that the draft falls and you look at the Cowboys' needs, they clearly know what they're doing here. They're taking a gamble, a risk, but I think there's an argument to be made that what's the gamble and risk of Tyron Smith being able to continue to be healthy for the next few years as well. So I would have chosen Tyron Smith. But so this may be the bold kind of move that you need to take and getting rid the kind of classic Belichick, get rid of a player a year earlier than you're supposed to and find their replacement. Maybe that's what's happening here.
I want to talk about some more of the offensive linemen, not only in the draft, but on the Cowboys roster, because I do think that maybe is playing an impact or playing a part of what their offseason strategy has been so far. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's the first thing that you do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run? Would you take a nap? Would you read a book? Maybe you'd catch up on some Locked On Cowboy podcasts that you haven't gotten to yet. I think that's always a good plan. A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had some more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can go and do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's done entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch your therapist at any time for any reason at no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We are answering your Twitter questions, and this final Twitter question comes from Thomas. He wants to know, what is your best guess for the true inactivity of the Cowboys? They aren't even bringing in veterans like Ronald Jones or re-signing Chuma Edoga.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just no urgency right now. I mean, the kind of guys that the Cowboys are looking to sign right now aren't, taking 5 visits with 5 different teams, during the first 2 days of legal tampering. I think the kind of players the Cowboys are interested in draft or signing are going to be available, and so I think right now they're still probably getting a lay of the land of the market. The kind of guys that we are assuming that they are signing, it's really like we're throwing darts. We don't really know necessarily what they're looking for as far as position wise. I mean, we know what the holes are and we know what they need to fill, but we don't necessarily know if is running back something that you're planning on filling in free agency or the draft. I don't know that that's been decided necessarily yet, because there's still some free agent running backs. There's obviously the guys in the draft. And I think also the answer is that they're going to use a little bit of both. So I was reading a tweet yesterday about how somebody was commenting on the Baltimore Ravens, and that you just never comment on what the Baltimore Ravens chances are going to be in March, because they always wait to kind of fill needs late. They end up doing it late in free agency.
Yeah.
They end up obviously doing things in the draft. The Cowboys don't get the benefit of that doubt, but that's what the Cowboys do too. And that's the thing, is that like the smart shoppers are shopping late where there's bargains, right? And I think that the thing is that we don't always recognize that the difference between the guy that signed for $5 million more on day one of legal tampering in some cases is only 5%, 10% better than the guy that's getting signed on the 10th or 15th day for the better than vet minimum, but still not nearly the market setting deal that the guys in the first few days are. So I think the Cowboys have made a conscious decision to be willing to risk the potential upside of getting those kind of first few day free agent signings with not, taking on a whole bunch of losses because you signed a guy that wasn't a good fit or was too old to kind of play up to his contract, that sort of thing. Whether that's a good strategy or not, I think that's obviously still very much up for debate. But I don't think we should just assume that because the Cowboys haven't, broken through and gotten where they need to go, that any one particular thing that the Cowboys do is like, their free agent posture and early in free agency, that's why they're not getting into the divisional round of the playoffs, or that's why they're not getting into the conference championship. Like, I don't think that the strategy itself is necessarily flawed. I think it's, sometimes they have not executed it as well, and sometimes they have. And I think that's pretty, par for the course, even for good teams that are in the playoffs every year.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, or at least talk about, you mentioned that we know what the needs are. I think we do. I mean, I think for the most part, like, we can identify a running back is a need. I think depth receiver might be a need, but maybe the Cowboys don't feel like it is a need. Maybe they really believe in Jalen Tolbert in year 3. Maybe they really believe in Jalen Brooks. The one spot that I'm wondering about is just on the offensive line. Let's just call it offensive line starter number 5. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The Cowboys have spent a lot of picks and a lot of money over the last basically 3 years on some offensive linemen, whether it's Austin Richards, Matt Waletzko, TJ Bass, who they gave a ton of money to last year, who played, Brock Hoffman, who you and I are not big Brock Hoffman fans, but it seems like at every single opportunity, the Cowboys are praising Brock Hoffman. And then one more, Earl Bostic Jr. That was the guy that the Cowboys gave the most guaranteed money to in free agency. Those are 5 offensive linemen. I wonder if they believe one of those 5 guys could be a starter for them this year, and they only need to address one offensive line spot early in the draft.
That could be the case. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that of those people that you just mentioned, I'm pretty sure Earl Bostic is the only one who has not lined up and played for the Cowboys in a short period of time, which, I mean, to me shows you need these guys, right? Like you need depth. You need lots of offensive linemen. It's not just 5, right? It's like you need 7.
Yeah.
At the minimum, I would think. And I don't mean 7 good offensive linemen. You need 7 guys who you can put out onto an NFL field that won't get you embarrassed, because offensive line play is incredibly difficult, and most teams don't have 4 good offensive linemen.
Yeah.
So
you need 7 capable guys that you can play a game with.
Yeah. So I think, you're spamming the position. You're finding it's one of these positions that you're trying to find guys like this tackle, like of the money 5 positions. However you can get these guys, right? You find them, you mine them, you find them in undrafted free agency, you develop a late round guy, you draft them high. That you just, whatever it takes, by hook or by crook, you got to get yourself an offensive tackle, a quarterback, a cornerback, and a wide receiver. And so those positions specifically, you're going to look wherever there are people physically capable of playing those positions, and you're going to bring them in. So I do think that they may have they may look at their situation and say, look, we got Hoffman, we got TJ Bass. We like what we've seen so far in just kind of offseason workouts with TJ Bass snapping the football. We obviously understand that he's a smart player.
And maybe they feel like, hey, we like the battle between Bass and Hoffman, and one of those 2 guys is going to win that job.
Yeah. And maybe it's that plus, but if Zach Frazier is there at 56, he's like a tier above these guys.
And then maybe we could slide TJ Bass over to left guard and then kick out Tyler Smith to left tackle.
And that's why I think what we'll see is, if we're going to see one more signing, I would bet that it's I would probably say tackle, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a guard. I would say that you'll get one more competent level offensive lining signing before the draft at either tackle or guard, with the idea that, okay, we don't get anything what we need. At the very least, we've got veteran offensive lineman Tyler Smith, TJ Bass, Richards, Waletzko, and one of those 3 can figure out one spot.
Let me give you an example. Like, I could see them signing, like, this is Dalton Reisner for a 1-year, $3 million deal, or a guy that I actually know pretty well, Greg Van Roten, who played outstanding for the Raiders last year, but he's 34 years old, right? You sign him to a 1-year, $3 million deal. And if the draft goes well, these guys develop, you cut him before the season, or you trade him for a 7th round pick, and you're not out anything.
Yeah. Or you hold on to him, right? Because again, you're going to use a ton of these guys. So
Andres Pete, maybe somebody like that.
Yeah. Like, there's guys out there that are still available that are, not going to get you killed offensive linemen, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to look.
Keep naming these guys. Yeah. There's a lot of them.
Because that's the thing. You're not looking for the upside guy in free agency. You're just stuck. If that's the problem, I think that a lot of these shoppers have, is that they're trying to find like the upside long-term solution in free agency. And that's just not a good place to go, because first of all, usually you're signing these guys as they're entering their prime and by the time they finish their contract, they're finished with their prime, right? So
Yep.
you want to kind of get like these positions in the draft where there is actual true upside. So
I agree.
I just think it's one of those things where you can definitely get to a stable ground in free agency, and that allows you to draft a little bit freer, but you're still going to want to draft for that upside at that tackle position at some point.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, we're bringing back the mock draft simulator.
Hey.
We haven't done this in a while. I know it always did so well last year. I think we're going to see what happens. We draft an offensive lineman in round 1 and see what the rest of the draft looks like. So make sure you guys are tuning in for that. Make sure you're downloading the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go check out the channel on YouTube. Go follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.